The evening light slanted across the nave of St. Oswald's, gilding the brass candlesticks and making the dust motes seem oddly celebratory. A small group of parishioners lingered by the front pews, shuffling hymn books and adjusting ribbons as though they were preparing not so much for a wedding as for a moderately ambitious fete. Miss Blatherwick, who was both chief bridesmaid and chief source of chatter, adjusted her hat with the air of a woman rehearsing for a larger audience. She corrected the posture of her younger cousin, murmuring, "Do remember, Angela, one must glide rather than plod." The vicar, Reverend Trotter, offered a weary smile and tapped the side of his prayer book with a finger that had grown blunt from years of shepherding parish committees, more quarrelsome than sheep. "Let us," he said, "attempt the entrance once more." The organist, Mr. Fenwick, pressed the keys and produced a tune which sounded as though Mendelssohn had been drafted into the army and was attempting to march in hobnailed boots. The group began their slow promenade up the aisle, adjusting hems and coughing discreetly. It was then, at precisely the point where the bride would have taken her place, that the interruption occurred. A voice, faint but unmistakably female, drifted from the vestry door. The words were blurred by echo, but several listeners swore afterwards that the sentence had been, "I never said yes." The effect was immediate. Angela gave a short squeal that resembled the whistle of the 5:15 stopping train. Miss Blatherwick clutched her handbag to her chest as though it were a crucifix. The vicar's prayer book slid from his hand, hitting the tiles with a snap that seemed part of the disturbance. Mr. Fenwick, whose fingers were still poised on the keyboard, produced an accidental chord which might, in another context, have been considered suitable for a horror film. There followed silence, a silence so taut that even the church mice appeared to pause in mid-scuttle. Then came the whisper, more distinctly, "I never said yes." The vestry door rattled slightly. Mrs. Pilkington, the verger's wife, dropped her feather duster and declared in a voice both thrilled and scandalized,
"That was her?"
repeated the vicar, his complexion drained of its clerical pink. "The bride?" Mrs. Pilkington breathed. "The late bride, poor Margaret Smeaton."
"I should know her voice anywhere." A collective shudder passed through the gathering.
It was well remembered that Margaret Smeaton had been buried only 3 weeks earlier, her nuptials curtailed by a sudden and ill-explained illness. Fenwick shut the organ lid with a bang that suggested retreat. "Nonsense," he said, though without much force. "Some trick of the pipes." "Pipes don't speak plain English," retorted Miss Blatherwick, already composing her version for tomorrow's conversations. The vicar attempted firmness. "It was an echo, possibly from outside." He walked with slow deliberation to the vestry door, placed a trembling hand on the handle, and opened it. Inside, there was only the stack of folding chairs, the faint odour of polish, and a draught from the ill-fitting window. He peered about, coughed, and closed the door again. "Empty," he declared, though with an expression more suitable to announcing an empty grave. But the congregation, or rehearsal party, at any rate, was not convinced. Angela had begun to sob quietly, repeating, "I heard her." "I did," Mrs. Pilkington murmured consolingly, while clearly delighted at the confirmation of her own belief. Pubright, who had entered quietly by the north door, observed the tableau with his usual mild detachment. He had intended only to check that the vicar had locked the vestry cupboard where parish registers were kept, following a small incident with mislaid marriage certificates. Instead, he found himself at the receiving end of a dozen startled glances. "Inspector!" cried Miss Blatherwick, as though he had materialized by conjuring.
"You heard it too, didn't you?"
Pubright inclined his head politely.
"I heard something. A voice," supplied Mrs. Pilkington with relish. The inspector looked at the vestry door, then at the faces before him, each flushed with excitement, fear, or the thrill of possible scandal.
He folded his hands behind his back, as though contemplating a window display rather than a disturbance of natural law. "Well," he said, in the tone of a man weighing parish accounts. It is a curious sort of echo. The group, grateful for his presence yet unsettled by his calmness, clustered together like passengers after a near derailment. The rehearsal, needless to say, was abandoned as they filed out into the gathering dusk.
Tongues loosened.
By the time the last hymn book was replaced, the incident had already divided itself neatly into 3 competing versions. A supernatural visitation from the wronged bride. A malicious prank, possibly by local youths. Proof that the church was structurally unsound and ought to have its vestry condemned immediately. Pubright, walking slowly down the aisle, paused where the bride had been meant to stand. He glanced at the vestry door once more. The silence now seemed perfectly ordinary, yet his expression suggested the matter would not be left entirely to Mrs. Pilkington's satisfaction. By the following morning, the tale had travelled farther and faster than any parish notice ever managed. It began at the butcher's counter, where Mrs. Pilkington repeated her experience with such detail that customers forgot their sausages and leaned dangerously close to the chopping block. Her voice, she insisted, wagging a forefinger like a metronome, as clear as when she sang in the choir. Poor Margaret, she was never content with the hymns chosen for her range. And last night, it was the same timbre.
I'd swear it before the bishop himself, Mr. Rawlings.
Whose only concern was obtaining a half-pound of bacon, muttered. Best not swear to bishops these days. They've plenty on their plate already. But his mutterings went unheeded. By midday, the hairdresser's salon had become the tribunal of record. Miss Blatherwick, reclining under a dryer hood, managed to raise her voice above the whir of machinery. She said, "I never said yes." That is what shook us. You see the implication? If Margaret spoke from beyond, it was not only ghostly, but also a statement about her feelings toward Mr. Wilton. The customers, their heads cocooned in curlers and towels, thrilled at the suggestion. Mr. Wilton, fiancé to the deceased, was known for his stiff collars, his obsession with punctuality, and his tiresome lectures on insurance policies. A posthumous refusal seemed plausible enough to anyone who had sat through his after-dinner speeches. By tea-time, the rumour had reached the snug of the King's Arms. Here it fermented happily among pints of mild old Mr. Pask, who claimed deafness when asked to pay his rounds, suddenly found his hearing remarkably restored. "Ghosts don't use grammar," he declared. That was a living tongue. Mark my words, somebody was behind that vestry door, and not of the heavenly sort. His companion, Mrs. Helliwell, sipped port and replied with relish, "Well, I don't wonder. That undertaker fellow has a sly look, don't you think? Always polishing his hearse as if it were a carriage fit for royalty."
Who knows what tricks he can manage with a coffin?
Thus the undertaker joined the list of culprits, alongside mischievous choirboys, vengeful cousins, and a suspected ventriloquist who once entertained at a Rotary dinner. The only establishment that tried to restrain the tide was the bakery. Miss Sharp, kneading dough with a violence that startled her apprentices, snapped at customers who attempted to raise the subject. This shop sells bread, not tales of the grave. If you want ghost stories, try the library. But even her buns seemed to swell with gossip, and customers left whispering all the louder for being scolded. Meanwhile, Inspector Pubright sat at his office desk, reviewing a stack of reports on unlicensed bicycles. His constable Love shuffled in with the delicate hesitation of one carrying news likely to be unwelcome. "Sir," Love began, "there's talk all over the high street." "About the bride?" "Yes," said Pubright without looking up. "They say she's been heard again. Well, that she might be heard again. Tonight, perhaps." "Interesting prediction," Pubright murmured. He tapped his pencil against the margin of his report. "And who is the prophet?" Love looked embarrassed. "Miss Pilkington, sir. She says the vestry may yield further
Utterances.
She's planning to attend choir practice, purely in a spirit of religious duty." Pubright allowed himself a faint smile. How selfless of her. The inspector leaned back and considered the ceiling. He knew the mechanics of small-town rumour. Every whisper added a layer of embroidery until the original thread was buried. The problem was not separating truth from falsehood, it was determining whether truth had been present at all. Outside the station, townsfolk gathered in small knots like starlings testing the air before a flight. Some argued earnestly about supernatural law. Others chuckled with the satisfaction of having something to discuss other than milk prices. At the post office, two clerks exchanged theories in tones of confidence. One maintained it was a prank by children sneaking in after dusk. The other was convinced it had been the bride herself, mistakenly buried alive.
"A scandal for the undertaker, if that's proved," he said, licking a stamp with relish.
By evening, the story had matured into something resembling folklore. Margaret Smeaton, once a modest clerk at the Building Society, had become in rumour a tragic heroine, silenced by sinister forces, rising from her coffin to denounce her fate. The more sober citizens shook their heads, but even they repeated the tale at supper tables, prefacing it with, "Of course, I don't believe a word of it." But, before continuing with eager detail, the church, meanwhile, was attracting more visitors than on any Sunday service. Young men lingered outside, hoping to impress their companions by pretending indifference. Elderly women hobbled along the path with the determination of pilgrims. Reverend Trotter, trying to prepare his sermon, found himself interrupted by knocks on the vicarage door every half hour. Each visitor professed casual concern for his welfare, but inevitably asked, "Did you really hear her, Vicar?" He maintained stoutly that it had been an echo, nothing more. Yet his nervous polishing of spectacles betrayed less confidence than his words. In the snug of the King's Arms, bets were laid on whether the voice would return that very night. The odds shortened rapidly as Mrs. Pilkington entered, triumphant, to announce that she would be attending vestry cleaning at dusk, thus ensuring she would be present should any further communication occur. Inspector Pubright, observing from a quiet corner, made no comment. He sipped his ginger beer, eyes half closed, listening not only to what was said, but to the eagerness with which it was uttered. He noted the small malice in Mrs. Helliwell's suspicion of the undertaker, the relish with which Miss Blatherwick repeated Margaret's supposed refusal, and the strangely guarded silence of Mr. Wilton, the bereaved fiancé, who had taken to avoiding company altogether. The town was alive, almost jubilant. With its ghost, yet, beneath the merriment, Pubright detected something quieter, less comfortable, the fear of what might still be uncovered about the bride's last days. And it was that undertone, not the whispers of the vestry, which held his attention. Inspector Pubright began his round of conversations the next morning with the patience of a man accustomed to drawing sense from the fog of village imagination. His first call was on Reverend Trotter, whose study smelled of old wood polish and nervous perspiration. The vicar rose hastily, knocking a pile of parish newsletters onto the carpet. "Inspector, I hardly know what to say."
"This whole business, why, it has turned my church into a sideshow attraction." Pubright inclined his head.
"I imagine you were present for both occasions?"
"Both? Oh, heavens! There has only been the one, unless people are counting Mrs. Pilkington's."
Rehearsals of the tale. The inspector allowed the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "She does seem to have memorized it," the vicar sighed.
"I heard something, yes."
"A voice, or a draught, or some resonance in the vestry timbers." "Nothing more." "Certainly not Margaret's shade?" Pubright asked. "Did Miss Smeaton often use the vestry during her time with the choir?" "Indeed, she was diligent."
"Always early, always careful with her music."
"A conscientious young woman," Reverend Trotter folded his hands. "Which makes it all the sadder that she is now the subject of such, well, entertainment." Pubright thanked him, recorded a few notes, and suggested the vicar take a rest from responding to door knockers. His next visit was to Mr. Fenwick, the organist, whose house carried the dual odour of pipe smoke and furniture polish too heavily applied. Fenwick received him with briskness. "If it is about that ridiculous rehearsal, Inspector, I can only repeat what I said at the time. It was not a ghost. It was some trick of acoustics. "This building is full of drafts and echoes," Pubright nodded mildly.
"And yet you seemed startled when it occurred. Any man would be startled if a vestry door rattled without human hand upon it." Fenwick's thin lips tightened.
"But I tell you, I know voices. I've trained choristers for 30 years. That was not Margaret."
"Too low in pitch, too rough at the edges."
"Nothing like her singing tone. Interesting," said Pubright. He did not add that most witnesses had been convinced it was unmistakably Margaret. "Besides," Fenwick continued, "Margaret was a sweet girl but without imagination. I cannot conceive her contriving to speak after burial, even if she wished." He delivered this with the air of having settled the matter permanently. Pubright accepted tea, endured a lecture on the organ's failing bellows, and departed with the impression that Fenwick disliked the subject, yet wished his scepticism thoroughly broadcast. Later, at the cottage of Miss Blatherwick, he was greeted with a rustle of curtains and a rapid unlocking of bolts. She ushered him into a parlour where doilies covered every surface like snowdrifts. "Inspector," she began breathlessly, "I have been waiting for you. I said to Angela only this morning, the police will have to come. They will not leave a mystery unexamined. And here you are." Pubright allowed her the satisfaction of being right.
"You were close enough to hear the words?" "Close enough? My dear man, I was practically at her elbow." "I never said yes."
Clear as a bell.
Oh, the irony of it, Inspector.
She had accepted that dreadful Mr. Wilton, and yet in her grave she rebelled. Did she ever, in life, express such reluctance? Pubright asked gently. Miss Blatherwick pursed her lips. Not to me, though she did once remark that his collars were exhausting to iron. But really, Inspector, one must not underestimate the tyranny of collars. He noted the remark with due solemnity.
"And you are certain it was Margaret's voice?"
"As certain as I am that these hyacinths are real." She gestured to a vase containing silk flowers of violent hue. Angela, hovering at the doorway, interjected timidly. "It didn't sound quite like Margaret to me. Not as I remembered from choir." Her cousin snapped. "Nonsense, Angela. Your ears were filled with fright." Pubright intervened smoothly. "It is always useful to hear more than one impression." He thanked them both, ignoring Miss Blatherwick's evident disappointment at Angela's contradiction. By late afternoon he had gathered enough impressions to fill several notebooks, but not enough to illuminate the mystery. He returned to the station where Constable Love awaited with the enthusiasm of a man who had overheard everything in town. "Sir, everyone's talking. They say it might be revenge from beyond. Some say it was the cousin, Edgar Smeaton, pretending to be her. Others claim Mr. Wilton himself arranged it, to put blame on the undertaker." Pubright looked up from his notes. "And what do you think, love?" The constable hesitated. "Well, sir, I think people don't like Mr. Wilton much, so they're glad of a reason to talk ill of him."
"As for Edgar, he's too fond of his beer to be creeping about churches." "A shrewd summary," Pubright said approvingly.
"It tells us rather more about the gossips than about the event." That evening, Pubright attended choir practice, standing discreetly at the back. He observed the singers casting anxious glances toward the vestry door, which stood innocently ajar. No voice interrupted them, though the sopranos produced several notes sharp enough to alarm the saints in their niches. Afterwards, the inspector strolled through the graveyard, pausing at Margaret Smeaton's stone, newly cut, the letters still pale against the granite. A modest inscription recorded her virtues without exaggeration. Fresh flowers lay at its base, evidence of recent devotion. He stood quietly, the dusk pressing around him, listening not for spectral words but for the living murmurs of the town, suspicion, envy, the delight of scandal. These, he reflected, were the true voices of Flaxborough. When he returned to the station, he penciled a single note across the top of his file. Witnesses inconsistent, some certainty too eager, some doubt too timid. Must listen between the lines. He closed the folder, content for the moment to let the town's chatter run its course. In time, amid the embroidery, the loose thread would reveal itself, and Pubright, patient as ever, would be ready to tug. Edgar Smeaton was not the sort of man who welcomed police visits, though his discomfort usually had more to do with unpaid accounts than with crime. When Inspector Pubright arrived at his small but over-furnished house, Edgar received him in a dressing gown that looked to have been inherited from a music hall comedian. "Inspector," he said, smiling nervously, "if this is about the darts team's expenses—"
"I assure you it was all above board." Pubright settled into a sagging armchair.
"It is not about darts, Mr. Smeaton. I should like to ask a few questions about your cousin Margaret." Edgar's smile wavered.
"Ah, yes, dreadful business."
Such a young woman taken so sudden. Still, she had good insurance. "That must have been a comfort," Pubright observed mildly. "Indeed. Though it went to her fiancé, Wilton."
"I suppose he needed it more than me."
"But there was a modest legacy to family, you understand. She left me a watch of her father's and a small sum."
"Kind gesture, very kind." He cleared his throat.
"But no one could say I had reason to wish her ill."
"We were not what you'd call close." Pubright allowed silence to stretch until Edgar filled it. "Look, Inspector, I've heard the talk."
"They say I was skulking in the vestry, throwing my voice like a circus clown. Nonsense. I was at the Hare and Hound that evening."
"Ask anyone."
"I'd hardly abandon a pint for theatrics in a draughty church." "Your alibi has been mentioned," Pubright said, scribbling a neat note. "You remained at the inn until closing?" "Until the very last bell." "I was in no fit state to walk straight, but several good fellows will confirm it." He attempted a laugh which died in his throat. Pubright regarded him with bland politeness. "Did you and your cousin quarrel?"
"Quarrel? Heavens, no."
"She was a decent girl, though rather too fond of respectability."
"Never did approve of my, ventures."
"But family is family. I never wished her harm." The inspector thanked him, stood, and remarked on the curious print of hunting dogs hung crookedly on the wall. Edgar seized the chance to expound on its supposed value, though his voice shook slightly, as though rehearsing a defense against unseen accusers. Outside, Pubright lingered at the gate, watching Edgar peer anxiously from behind lace curtains. A man of appetites, but not perhaps of subtle plots. Yet the town had already written him into the drama. Back at the police station, Constable Love was eager with fresh gossip.
"So you'll like this."
Edgar's debts are deeper than the river. Owes the bookmaker, owes the grocer, owes half the town. If Margaret had lived to marry Wilton, she might have rescued him. But now, Pubright said, the legacy was hardly enough to solve matters. Love nodded. Still, the talk is he had motive.
"People say he couldn't bear her marrying into Wilton's money while he was left scraping." Pubright tapped his pencil.
Talk supplies more motive than reality. Yet gossip often reveals what people wish were true. That evening he called discreetly on Mr. Wilton, the bereaved fiancé. Wilton received him stiffly in a parlour lined with insurance pamphlets and meticulously dusted photographs. "You must understand, Inspector," Wilton said, "that I am still grieving."
She was my future."
"This town may think what it likes, but she was content with me." "Perfectly content?" Pubright asked gently. "Did she ever express doubts about the marriage?"
"Never, absolutely never."
"We had occasional disagreements about household budgeting, but no more."
"The idea that she said I never said yes." His voice caught.
"It's cruel."
"Utterly cruel." The inspector inclined his head.
"Yet it troubles you enough to deny it so firmly." Wilton's jaw clenched.
"It troubles me because it slanders her memory."
"Some mischief maker is behind it. Perhaps Edgar, perhaps Fenwick."
"I don't know."
"But I will not have Margaret's name used for tavern amusement." He escorted Pubright to the door with the precision of a man controlling both grief and conversation. On the walk back through the market square, Pubright reflected. The cousin had debts, the fiancé had pride, and the town had imagination enough to condemn them both without evidence. It was, in its way, a collective inheritance from Margaret, a legacy of suspicion. The next day brought confirmation of Edgar's alibi. 3 men at the Hare and Hound swore he had remained until closing, singing tunelessly and attempting to play darts with 2 left hands. Constable Love was disappointed. That clears him then. Clears him of being in the vestry, Pubright corrected, but not of being useful to those who prefer a convenient suspect. Love frowned. You mean folks will still point the finger? Precisely, and in pointing they reveal more of themselves than of Edgar. Later that week, during a stroll past the churchyard, Pubright overheard 2 women debating loudly. One insisted Edgar had stolen into the vestry through the side door. The other declared he was too drunk to walk straight. Both agreed, however, that he was untrustworthy, which satisfied them more than evidence. Pubright paused at Margaret's grave once again. The flowers were beginning to wilt. He considered the inscription, then the shadows lengthening across the stones. The bride had spoken, or so the town said. But it was the living who shaped her words, each twisting them to fit their own grievances. Edgar might be innocent of trickery, yet innocence was seldom protection in Flaxborough's court of gossip. Pubright made a fresh note in his file. Alibi solid, but reputation weak. Must observe who most desires his guilt. The morning sun cast a thin brightness across St. Oswald's graveyard, lending each headstone a reluctant gleam. Inspector Pubright, accompanied by Constable Love, had agreed to walk the grounds after a parishioner reported disturbance among the flowers. Mrs. Winch, who prided herself on tidying the graves, met them by the lich gate with a face flushed by righteous alarm.
Inspector, it is scandalous.
Someone has been meddling with poor Margaret's resting place. I found petals scattered like confetti, and the soil disturbed as if by a careless dog. Or by a careless mourner, Pubright suggested gently. Mrs. Winch sniffed. Mourners don't dig, Inspector. They weep. At the grave, the disturbance proved real enough. A small patch of earth near the base had been turned, not deeply, but sufficient to scatter crumbs of chalk and soil onto the grass. Amidst this, something metallic glinted. Constable Love bent, retrieved it, and held it up.
A ring, sir. It was plain gold, slightly dulled, but with the unmistakable shape of a wedding band.
Inside, faint engravings spelled the letters MS to A.W. Pubright examined it closely, then slipped it into his pocket notebook.
Interesting. Mrs. Winch leaned in with relish. Now you see.
She's trying to speak again, sending us signs, Inspector. The ring's her message, or someone's litter, Pubright said mildly. But his eyes lingered on the disturbed soil. The band nestled there as though carefully placed. Word of the discovery spread faster than Sunday sermons. By afternoon, the market town buzzed with talk of Margaret's ring rising from the grave. The more imaginative claimed it had slipped from her hand during burial, now forced to the surface by restless conscience. Others swore someone had dug into the coffin itself. At the King's Arms, speculation grew positively theological. Mr. Pask declared, "It's proof she didn't agree to wed Wilton. That ring was forced upon her, and she spat it out from beyond." His drinking companion, more practical, replied, "Coffins don't spit, Pask. Someone went digging, and not for turnips." Purbright's inquiries began with the jeweller's shop on High Street. Mr. Cartwright, proprietor and amateur moralist,
examined the band under a magnifying glass. "Yes, I sold this
6 months ago. Young Wilton bought it. Came in twice before deciding, measured twice, paid once. Very thorough fellow. You remember it distinctly?"
Pubright asked. "I remember his manner."
Businesslike, yet anxious to appear romantic. He even had the inscription prepared before proposing.
"Rather presumptuous, don't you think?"
Cartwright pursed his lips. "Not a man of spontaneity." Did Margaret collect it herself?
No, he did.
She never came in. That evening, Pubright called once more at Wilton's neat little house. Producing the ring, he asked, "Is this familiar?" Wilton's face tightened.
Yes, that was Margaret's. Where did you— In the churchyard soil. Wilton blinked once, twice.
Impossible. She wore it when she was laid to rest. I placed it on her hand myself. Yet here it is. Wilton drew a handkerchief across his brow. And someone has desecrated her grave.
Inspector, I insist you act. It is abominable. Of course, Pubright said calmly.
Tell me, was Margaret ever reluctant to wear the ring? No, she was proud to have it. She admired the engraving. You are certain? Quite certain. Pubright left him pacing, his composure crumbling under the weight of both indignation and some more private concern. The following day, the inspector walked again with Constable Love. Could be pranksters, sir, Love suggested.
Digging about for a lark.
Though a ring's a queer choice of trophy. Queer indeed, Pubright agreed. Pranksters usually prefer items that can be paraded before friends. A ring with initials is incriminating.
Hardly useful for boasting, so someone wanted it found.
Pubright smiled faintly. Possibly. Or wanted it lost but lacked the courage to throw it farther than the churchyard. Love scratched his head. If she wore it to the grave and it's here now.
Someone opened the coffin.
Pubright did not reply. His silence suggested contemplation rather than agreement. Later that week, Pubright received a quiet word from the undertaker, Mr. Chubb. They met in the back room of his funeral parlour, surrounded by polished coffins that glowed like mahogany sermons. Chubb shifted uncomfortably.
Inspector, I heard the talk.
Folk are saying coffins disturbed, that I'm careless. I can assure you, sir, no one interfered while it was under my care. The coffin was sealed proper, lowered decent, filled in under my eye, yet the ring was above ground, Pubright said softly. Chubb wiped his spectacles. Then someone's been meddling since. I don't like to say it, but the churchyard's poorly kept after dark. Any determined soul could slip in. Any reason why they should? Chubb hesitated. There was mention, sir.
Whispered.
That Margaret might have been buried with her jewellery. A brooch, some earrings. Nothing grand, but enough to tempt a mean sort. Pubright filed this quietly. And were such items indeed placed with her? Chubb's lips thinned. Her fiancé insisted on the ring.
As for the rest, I wouldn't know.
I sealed what I was given. The inspector thanked him, left him polishing a coffin lid with nervous energy, and strolled into the dusk. That night, Pubright sat at his desk and reviewed the ring again. A modest band, yet one which carried weight beyond its gold. Its sudden appearance in the graveyard did not, he thought, signify Margaret's voice from beyond. It signified someone's hand in the present. He wrote in his notebook, "The ring's journey tells a story, not Margaret's, but someone else's." Then, beneath that, a second line. Who benefits from suggesting she never wished to marry? The faintest smile touched his lips. In Flaxborough, benefit was never measured solely in money. Reputation, envy, relief, revenge, these too were currencies, and the ring might prove a coin passed from hand to hand. For now, he closed the file and extinguished the lamp, but the thought lingered. The bride's silence had become louder than any voice, and those who claimed to hear her were perhaps only echoing themselves. The town's curiosity, far from waning, had only widened its orbit. Inspector Pubright, observing from his patient vantage, noted how each new whisper drew more names into the circle of suspicion. By now, nearly half the parish had been implicated in some fashion. It began with the church warden, Mr. Hargreaves, who prided himself on balancing accounts down to the penny and ensuring the choir never sang faster than he approved. At the Monday evening council, he declared stoutly, "This nonsense about voices and rings is nothing but disruption. Someone wishes to embarrass the parish committee, and I, gentlemen, will not stand for it." The fact that he declared it 3 times, growing redder with each repetition, convinced his fellow councillors that he must be hiding something. By Tuesday morning, Hargreaves was said to have been seen slipping out of the churchyard after midnight. though the witness later admitted it might have been a lamp-post in the fog. Then there was Fenwick, the organist. His sharp manner and talent for mimicry had already been mentioned in tavern corners. It emerged, thanks to Mrs. Helliwell's sharp ears, that he had once performed comic turns at private parties, imitating voices to much applause. By the time she finished her account at the bakery, Fenwick had been transformed into a master ventriloquist capable of conjuring spirits from thin air. Pubright paid him another visit. "Mr. Fenwick," he asked politely, "is it true you once entertained at parties with impressions?" Fenwick sniffed. When pressed, "A man must sometimes oblige friends, but I resent the suggestion that such trifles connect to this sorry affair." "Nevertheless," Pubright said, "you have a skill which might make an echo seem more articulate." Fenwick's fingers drummed irritably on the piano stool. "Inspector, do you imagine I would desecrate a church service with parlour tricks? My loyalty to the liturgy is beyond question." "Beyond question to you, perhaps," Pubright murmured, and took his leave, leaving Fenwick muttering about the decline of manners, the undertaker. Mr. Chubb also found himself under scrutiny. His sombre air, so necessary to his profession, was interpreted as concealment. Townsfolk now suggested he had hidden valuables in coffins, or worse, extracted them. Chubb confronted Pubright in the street, wringing his bowler hat like a dishcloth.
"Inspector, you must put a stop to this. I've been accused of pilfering brooches, necklaces, even a family clock. A clock, if you please. Do they imagine I bury timepieces?"
"I imagine," Pubright said gently, "they imagine whatever serves their satisfaction."
"Tell me, Mr. Chubb, did Margaret's coffin contain anything other than the ring?"
Chubb looked offended. "Nothing of value, I assure you, unless one counts dignity." "Some do not," Pubright observed. Amidst this growing field, a more private quarrel surfaced. Two women from the Women's Guild, long-time rivals in sponge cake competitions, were overheard disputing in the church porch.
One hissed, "Your nephew had reason to keep Margaret silent."
"She caught him fiddling accounts." The other retorted, "Better a fiddler than a drunkard. Everyone knows your brother was sweet on her and had no chance once Wilton appeared." Thus the circle widened yet again. Pubright listened to these enlargements with quiet interest. He saw how Margaret's ghost, real or fabricated, served as a convenient cloak for all manner of resentments. A town that might otherwise quarrel over knitting patterns now busied itself assigning guilt in tones of righteous certainty. At the police station, Constable Love reported each rumour with scholarly precision. "Sir, today's additions are Hargreaves the churchwarden, Fenwick the organist, Chubb the undertaker."
"And half the Women's Guild. Oh, and the grocer's assistant. Though that may have been a joke." Pubright leaned back.
"Excellent. The more suspects we have, the less useful any single one appears. It is a pattern of human society, Love. When everyone is guilty, no one is." Love frowned. "So who's left?" "Those who remain silent," Pubright replied. One such figure was Mrs. Wilton Senior, mother of the bereaved fiancé. She lived in a neat villa at the edge of town, where lace curtains twitched more than they billowed. Pubright called upon her one afternoon, finding her arranging chrysanthemums with unnecessary severity. "My son is blameless," she announced, before he had opened his notebook. Margaret was a suitable match, if a little common. Her death was tragic, of course, but these rumours about her reluctance, pure invention. My son would never coerce a woman. His policies are his only passion. Indeed, Pubright said, scribbling.
And you, madam, did you approve of the engagement?
I tolerated it, for his sake, but I knew it would not last. The girl lacked stamina. One could see it in her complexion. Not robust enough for a Wilton household. Pubright thanked her and took his leave, reflecting that faint disdain could sometimes whisper louder than open opposition. By Friday evening, the town had split into factions. One swore Fenwick was guilty, another favoured Edgar Smeaton, while a smaller but determined group insisted the grave itself was speaking. Bets circulated again at the King's Arms, with odds posted on the slate behind the bar. It was at this moment that Pubright chose to widen his own circle, not of suspects but of observation. He instructed Love to note who most energetically spread each rumour, who appeared most relieved when a new suspect was proposed, and who avoided discussion altogether. Watch behaviour, not words, he advised. Words change with the hour, but behaviour lingers. That weekend, Pubright attended evensong. The church was unusually crowded, filled less with piety than anticipation. When the final hymn faded, all ears strained toward the vestry. Nothing emerged but the rustle of cassocks. Yet in the silence, Pubright noticed Fenwick's sideways glance toward Hargreaves, Hargreaves's stiff posture when Chubb passed, and Mrs. Pilkington's theatrical shiver as though rehearsing for the benefit of neighbours. It was not the dead who spoke, but the living through glances, whispers, and the small betrayals of posture. Later at home, Pubright wrote in his notebook, "The circle expands, yet its centre remains hidden. Gossip convenient to many, but truth inconvenient to someone. Must narrow focus to those who gain from confusion." He closed the book with quiet satisfaction. For while the town's imagination widened the cast, the inspector knew the true circle was smaller, and someone within it had already betrayed themselves. The parish hall was full to its rafters, though the advertised subject of the meeting, the repainting of the vestry roof, was hardly reason enough. The real draw was the unspoken possibility that Margaret Smeaton might once more disturb the living with her disembodied protest. Inspector Pubright attended unobtrusively, seated near the back with Constable Love. The hall smelled of varnish and boiled tea, its chairs arranged in neat rows that sagged immediately under the weight of parishioners. Mr. Hargreaves, the church warden, opened proceedings with a cough that suggested both authority and indigestion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "this gathering is strictly for business. Let us not be distracted by idle fancies. We are here to discuss estimates for paint." His words floated above a sea of expectant silence. Everyone waited not for details of paint, but for something else, something that would lift the evening into notoriety. It came during Fenwick's interjection. The organist, seated stiffly at the front, rose to quibble about the quality of lead-based varnish. His voice was sharp, nasal, and quite unmistakably alive. Yet from the back of the hall, interrupting him, there came a second voice. I never said yes. The words were softer than before, but clearer in their diction, as though a rehearsal had perfected them. A ripple ran through the audience, gasps, squeals, and one clatter of a dropped walking stick. Fenwick froze, his mouth open. The interruption echoed faintly from the rafters. "Again," cried Mrs. Pilkington, positively radiant. "She is here with us." The vicar crossed himself hurriedly. Hargreaves banged the table, shouting for order. But it was too late. Panic and fascination had broken loose. Constable Love half rose, scanning the hall. "From the back, sir." Pubright gestured for him to remain calm. "Stay seated. Listen." The hall erupted into chatter, each person certain they had heard the sound from a different direction. Some pointed toward the cloakroom, others the side door. One boy swore it came from the ceiling beams. Meanwhile, Fenwick recovered himself and barked, "Some fool is mocking the dead." "I demand they be expelled." His voice cracked, betraying more agitation than indignation. Pubright rose at last, his calm presence easing the uproar. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, let us not trample reason in our haste. If someone wishes to repeat the words, they may do so now." The hall hushed. No voice emerged, only the creak of chairs and the rustle of anxious clothing. "Very well," Pubright said evenly. "We will continue the meeting, but I will remain until it ends." The remainder of the agenda limped along. Paint estimates lost their urgency. Even Hargreaves abandoned his usual insistence on pennies. Every head kept turning toward the rear, where no culprit could be seen. When the chairs were folded and parishioners departed, Pubright and Love stayed behind. "From the back, sir," Love repeated.
"Oh, I'd swear it." "Perhaps," Pubright replied.
"But sound is a trickster. It prefers to travel where suspicion already points." He examined the cloakroom and the doors. No footprints, no disturbance. Only a faint smell of polish and a cracked window through which a draught slipped. Love frowned. Then how did it happen? Purbright's eyes rested on Fenwick, who was hastily gathering his papers, muttering curses under his breath. "Sometimes, Constable, the obvious is not to be dismissed merely because it's obvious." The next morning, rumour spread with renewed vigour. "She spoke again," declared Mrs. Pilkington, who had now taken to repeating the phrase with the air of a theatrical prompter, this time before the entire parish. "No one can deny it now," the grocer's wife added embellishment. "She said it louder, clearer, like a proper announcement."
As if she wished to be heard in every house. By noon,
the tale had reached the public bar of the King's Arms. Mr. Pask claimed the voice had come from the very throat of Fenwick himself, thrown about the hall like a ventriloquist's dummy. "Mark me," he said, slapping the table. "That man can make a kettle sound like a choir boy. He's guilty as sin." Others disagreed, insisting it had been Wilton, hidden at the back, disguising his voice to smear his fiancée's name further. A smaller, more sinister theory claimed Margaret had been buried alive after all, her ghost now rehearsing complaints until her coffin was opened. Pubright paid a quiet call on Fenwick later that day. He found the organist pale and defensive. "You were accused of mimicry last night," Pubright said gently. "Do you deny it?" "Of course." My throat was dry, my hands trembling. "Do you think I'd humiliate myself so publicly?" "And yet," Pubright observed, "you are skilled in reproducing voices. I've heard it said you once imitated a bishop so well that his own curate applauded." Fenwick's eyes narrowed. "A childish trick, Inspector. But I would not use it to disturb the dead. Whoever spread that voice wishes to ruin me." "Or," Pubright said, "to hide behind you." Fenwick looked away. "Then they have succeeded." That evening, Pubright walked alone through the square. Lamps glowed dimly, and behind lace curtains he glimpsed shadows gesturing, gossip fermenting into certainty. What struck him was not the words themselves, but the eagerness with which people seized upon them. He paused by the church, gazing up at its silent windows. Twice now the same phrase had been spoken. "I never said yes." Always the same words, unchanged, as though rehearsed. Not a ghost, Pubright thought. Ghosts are seldom so consistent. But a human with intention, repeating carefully, like a message drilled into the air. The town could not see it yet, blinded by superstition. But to Pubright, the repetition was the clue. He returned to the station and wrote in his notebook. Another voice, same phrase, improved delivery.
Practiced hand.
Fenwick plausible, but perhaps too convenient. Must observe who thrives upon repetition. He closed the book. Outside, the town hummed with speculation. Inside, Pubright sat calmly, knowing the truth was drawing nearer, even as the voices grew louder. The next morning found Inspector Pubright at his desk earlier than usual. The station was quiet, save for the faint scratching of Constable Love wrestling with a report on bicycle lamps. Outside, the market square rattled with carts and chatter. But in Purbright's office the air seemed suspended, as though the inspector's stillness set its own rhythm. He opened his notebook and read through his entries. Voices, ring, inheritance, mimicry. A list as dry as parish minutes, yet each line hummed with the weight of gossip. He leaned back, allowing the pieces to drift through his mind like figures in the mist. The phrase, "I never said yes," was peculiar in its plainness. Ghosts in stories moaned, wailed, or begged. This one issued a complaint as firm as any parish objection to a planning notice. It was neither plea nor curse. but declaration. That was what made it so unsettling. Pubright considered Margaret herself, quiet, diligent, respectable to the marrow. She had worked at the building society, balancing ledgers without flourish, never late, rarely smiling too widely.
A woman, he thought, who might well have accepted an engagement more out of duty than rapture.
Yet would such a woman after death find her voice in protest?
Unlikely, he murmured aloud.
The dead seldom contradict themselves. Love looked up from his papers. Sir? Nothing, Constable. Merely a philosophical remark. Love nodded, accustomed to such diversions. Pubright rose and paced to the window. He watched Mrs. Pilkington cross the square, stopping at 3 separate groups to recount something with grand gestures. A conductor without orchestra, yet the tune carried. That, Pubright reflected, was the essence of Flaxborough, an eagerness to embroider. One woman's thrill became another's certainty. In such soil, suspicion sprouted faster than dandelions. He thought of Edgar Smeaton, his debts and his nervous eyes.
Of Fenwick, too sharp by half, guilty of nothing more than ill temper perhaps.
Of Wilton, precise and stiff, more offended by scandal than by bereavement. Each might be innocent, yet each offered the town nourishment for its imagination. The ring troubled him most.
Objects seldom lied.
A band engraved with initials did not uproot itself. Someone had wished it to be seen. The question was not how it reached the surface, but why. Returning to his desk, Pubright wrote slowly, "The town believes in a ghost. The town delights in a ghost, but behind the ghost stands a hand, and behind the hand a motive." He underlined the last word twice. At noon, he took his lunch at the cafe by the square, ordering weak tea and a sandwich as uninspiring as the decor. Yet here, among chatter, he found nourishment of another kind. The talk at neighbouring tables drifted inevitably to the bride. She must have been forced, one woman declared. No girl in her right mind would marry a man who dusts his collars daily. Nonsense, replied her companion. She had her eye on his insurance salary. Practical as you like. It's the cousin he'd gained from her changing her mind. Pubright sipped his tea. Each theory reflected less of Margaret and more of the speaker, their envies, their grievances, their quiet desires to see certain people lowered. When he returned to the station, he found Love waiting eagerly. "Sir, I've drawn up a list of everyone who claims to have heard the voice." "Excellent," Pubright said. "Now draw up a list of those who claim not to have heard it." Love looked puzzled.
"But that'll be shorter." "Precisely.
Those who resist the thrill of belief often reveal more than those who embrace it." That evening, Pubright allowed himself a solitary walk by the river. The water glimmered faintly under the setting sun, reeds whispering in the breeze. He paused by the bridge, considering the rhythm of small-town life, church bells, market cries, pub gossip. Into that pattern the voice had intruded, like a sour note in a hymn. What fascinated him was not the phrase itself, but its repetition.
"Once might be chance."
Twice suggested practice. Each time it grew more polished, more confident, as though the speaker relished performance. He thought of Fenwick, whose talent for mimicry was undeniable. Yet Fenwick had seemed too rattled, too prickly, to be the director of such a show. He thought, too, of Wilton, whose pride might demand defence of his reputation, but not theatrical display, and Edgar, too fond of ale, too careless for rehearsal, which left, perhaps, someone not yet named aloud. Someone content to let the town accuse others, while quietly guiding suspicion like a hand on the tiller. Pubright exhaled, watching the ripples spread across the water. Human nature, he thought, loved drama but feared silence. Margaret's quietness in life had been unremarkable. In death, her alleged voice had become irresistible. But truth, he reminded himself, was seldom shouted. It whispered, often in the pauses between louder declarations. He turned back toward the station, his figure blending into the dimming light. On his desk, he wrote one final note for the day. Observe not the words spoken, but the appetite with which they are repeated. There lies the shadow of guilt. He closed the book, satisfied that the real investigation was no longer into what had been heard, but into why the town so longed to hear it. Inspector Pubright believed in the power of politeness. He knew that in Flaxborough a blunt accusation would only produce indignation, but a courteous remark, dropped like a crumb, could draw out more than a constable's notebook ever might. It was with this in mind that he arranged a quiet tea at Mrs. Marlowe's boarding house, inviting both Fenwick the organist and Hargreaves the churchwarden. The invitation itself was unremarkable, to discuss parish concerns in a spirit of cooperation. The reality was less administrative. Mrs. Marlowe, flattered to provide the venue, had laid out sponge cake and thin sandwiches with the anxious zeal of one who hoped scandal might brush her tablecloth. Fenwick arrived first, stiff as a tuning fork, carrying a folder of sheet music as if to remind the world of his dignity. Hargreaves followed, perspiring heavily, already muttering about costs of roof paint. Pubright greeted them with his mild smile and ensured they were seated close enough to hear each other's breathing. Over tea, conversation began innocently. Hargreaves complained of committee squabbles, Fenwick of choir sloppiness. Pubright nodded agreeably, encouraging them with small murmurs. At last he said, "You know, gentlemen, it is curious how often churches reveal more in whispers than in sermons. Only last week I was reminded how burial rites can linger in people's minds." Hargreaves stiffened, wiping his brow with a napkin. Fenwick glanced sharply, his teacup rattling against the saucer. "Oh yes," Pubright continued smoothly. "One wonders who attended to the details of Margaret Smeaton's interment. A ring here, a flower there. Such matters may seem trivial, yet they remain fixed in memory, sometimes more fixed than the ceremony itself." Fenwick coughed, muttering, "Rings are hardly my department." "Indeed," Pubright agreed mildly. "And yet it is striking how often her voice, if voice it is, mentions consent rather than eternity."
"I never said yes."
Such a peculiar refrain.
"One might think it chosen deliberately." Almost rehearsed, Hargreaves dabbed at his temple, avoiding Fenwick's eye.
The silence thickened, broken only by Mrs. Marlowe's overloud clatter as she removed the teapot. Pubright set down his cup. "Forgive me, I do ramble, but one cannot help noticing that a phrase, when repeated often enough, takes on life of its own. Much like a hymn, would you not agree, Mr. Fenwick?" The organist flushed. "If you imply I am responsible for this travesty—" "I imply nothing," Pubright interrupted gently. "Merely that some phrases ring too clearly to be accident." Fenwick's indignation rose, then faltered. He gathered his music sheets hastily. "I will not sit here to be insulted. Good day, Inspector." He left abruptly, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the teaspoons. Hargreaves shifted uneasily in his chair. The man's temper damns him more than any evidence. "If you ask me, it is obvious who has been putting on a show." "Perhaps," Pubright said softly. "But anger sometimes conceals fear, and fear conceals truth. One must tread carefully." Hargreaves gulped his remaining tea as though it were brandy. Later, Pubright walked back to the station, musing on the reactions. Fenwick's outburst had been predictable, but the churchwarden's perspiration told its own story. Guilt or anxiety? Not the same, but easily confused. At the station, Constable Love awaited him with news. "So more gossip today. They say the voice will speak again on Sunday. Some swear it's Margaret warning against her own marriage. Others, that it's her accusing Wilton of neglect. And one fellow insists she's after Edgar's debts." Pubright smiled faintly. "It seems the dead are most versatile when the living require it." Love looked puzzled. "So what's next?" "Next, Constable, we shall provide an opportunity. If someone has practiced this voice, they may not resist another performance." Sunday service dawned bright, but tense. The church was packed, not with worshippers alone, but with spectators eager for a haunting. Pubright attended discreetly, seated near the vestry. The hymns rose, Fenwick at the organ pressing the keys with mechanical precision. The congregation shifted restlessly, every ear strained not for the sermon but for interruption. When the final prayer ended, silence descended.
Heads tilted toward the vestry. And then, as if on cue, the phrase returned. "I never said yes." Gasps rippled.
Several women clutched their handbags like shields, but this time Pubright was ready. He stepped quickly into the vestry, Constable Love close behind. The room was empty, save for a small funnel placed behind the folding chairs, its narrow mouth directed toward a crack in the door. A thin string ran from it into the shadows of the choir loft. Pubright lifted it calmly. "A speaking tube," he murmured. Love blinked. "So someone's been piping it in, sir?" "Precisely. A simple contraption, yet effective when coupled with a willing imagination." They followed the string upward into the loft, but there it ended in an empty coil. Whoever had operated it had slipped away during the commotion. Still, the discovery was enough. Pubright returned to the nave, holding the funnel aloft. The crowd gasped again, this time not in awe, but in sheepish realization. "A trick," he said gently.
"Not a ghost."
A voice carried by pipe and string, impressive in its simplicity. The congregation shuffled uncomfortably. Some looked relieved, others disappointed. Mrs. Pilkington, however, wore a face of tragic outrage, as though cheated of her personal apparition. Pubright watched her carefully. Disappointment, he reflected, was sometimes as revealing as guilt. That evening, back at his desk, he wrote in his notebook, "The trap reveals the method, not yet the hand."
Tube discovered, operator vanished.
Who had both access and motive? Fenwick plausible but too obvious. Hargreaves anxious. Others gain by confusion. Next step, narrowed to one who thrives most from scandal. He underlined the last phrase. The courteous trap had rattled cages, but the bird he sought had yet to flutter into view. The town of Flaxborough had seldom known such anticipation. By Tuesday evening, the police station's small conference room was filled to capacity with those directly entangled in the business of the bride who spoke. The gathering had the atmosphere of a parish fete, though one held under the shadow of judgment. Inspector Pubright presided at the head of the table, his manner calm, almost domestic, as though about to discuss alterations to bus timetables. Beside him sat Constable Love, notebook poised. The invited company included Fenwick the organist, upright and indignant, Hargreaves the churchwarden, perspiring copiously, Chubb the undertaker, gloomy as ever, Edgar Smeaton, ill at ease in an over-loud tie, and Wilton the fiancé, taut with suppressed outrage. Mrs. Pilkington had smuggled herself in, claiming to be a witness of spiritual authority. Pubright, knowing resistance was futile, allowed her a chair at the back. He began gently. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. We have all endured weeks of rumour, speculation, and no small amount of melodrama.
"It is now my duty to explain what truly happened," Fenwick snorted.
At last, Pubright ignored him. "Let us start with the phrase itself. I never said yes. It was heard first during a rehearsal, then later at the parish meeting, and again at Sunday's service. Each time identical in words and cadence. Ghosts, I am told, are inconsistent. Humans, however, can repeat themselves with practice." There was a stir. Fenwick flushed, Hargreaves shifted, and Mrs. Pilkington whispered theatrically, "I knew it." Pubright continued. "On Sunday, we discovered a simple device, a speaking tube hidden in the vestry, its cord leading to the choir loft. This demonstrates that the voice was projected deliberately, not supernaturally." Wilton leaned forward. Then it was Fenwick.
"I said so from the beginning." "Not so fast," Pubright said mildly.
Mr. Fenwick indeed has talent for mimicry, but his reaction on each occasion was one of surprise, even distress. More importantly, he was positioned where he could not have manipulated the tube without attracting notice. Fenwick straightened triumphantly. "The question, then," Pubright went on, "is who had both access to the vestry and reason to create such disturbance. For that we must consider the ring." A murmur swept the room. Pubright held up the plain band. "This was discovered in the graveyard soil. Mr. Wilton insists he placed it upon Margaret's hand in the coffin. Mr. Chubb confirms the coffin was sealed. Therefore, for the ring to appear above ground, it must have been removed and planted afterwards. Why? To suggest that Margaret rejected the engagement." Wilton's face paled.
"A monstrous fabrication."
"Indeed," Pubright said. "The scheme relied on persuading the town that Margaret had not consented. The phrase, the ring, the whispers, they all reinforced the same message." He looked slowly around the table. Such a scheme could serve two purposes: to discredit Mr. Wilton, or to distract from another interest.
"Let us consider who benefited," Edgar blurted. "Don't look at me. I was in the Hare and Hound. Ask anyone."
"Quite so," Pubright said smoothly. "Your alibi is sound, though your reputation unfortunately less so. Yet you stood to gain nothing from blackening Margaret's memory. Indeed, you would more likely have begged her charity than condemned her." Edgar sagged with relief. "As for Mr. Chubb," Pubright continued, "rumour has been unkind, but desecrating graves brings no profit to an undertaker. He buries, he does not exhume." Chubb bowed gravely, as though presiding at his own vindication. Pubright turned his gaze upon Hargreaves. "The churchwarden has been most insistent that these disturbances threatened parish order."
"And yet, Mr. Hargreaves, it was you who alone had nightly access to the vestry and loft. You who locked up after meetings. You who fussed endlessly with keys and windows." Hargreaves gaped. I was maintaining order."
"Precisely," Pubright said quietly. "But the order you sought was not for the parish. It was for yourself. You had appropriated certain funds from the roof repair account. A small matter, perhaps, but one which Margaret, in her role at the Building Society, had begun to suspect. Her sudden death was convenient, but whispers still threatened discovery. So you devised a distraction, a ghost bride, protesting consent, all eyes fixed upon Wilton while you busied yourself in shadows." A gasp rose. Hargreaves stammered. "That is outrageous!"
"You have no proof."
Purbright's tone remained courteous. "Proof enough. Your fingerprints upon the funnel, your nervous outbursts whenever burial rites were mentioned, and your eagerness to denounce others. And, of course, the money already traced. The bank confirms discrepancies." Hargreaves slumped, his handkerchief sodden in his grip. The room exhaled as one. Mrs. Pilkington whispered dramatically.
"I always suspected," Fenwick muttered. "At least my choir is exonerated." Wilton, red with indignation, demanded,
"And Margaret's name, her honour, will be cleared." Pubright inclined his head. "Yes, the voice was not hers, but his." He nodded at the broken churchwarden. When the meeting dispersed, townsfolk spilled into the square, their tongues already sharpening. Some pitied Hargreaves, others rejoiced at his fall. Yet all agreed the bride herself had at last been laid to rest in peace. Back in his office, Pubright wrote the final line of his report. Truth seldom shouts. It whispers politely until heard. In the week following the revelation, Flaxborough returned to its routines with the air of a cat resuming sleep after a brief, dramatic yawn. Shops opened, buses trundled, gossip shifted back to the price of fish. Yet, beneath the surface, the town wore a faintly altered expression, as if each face carried the memory of the bride who had never truly spoken. The church itself experienced a sudden burst of popularity. Congregants filled the pews, not out of heightened piety, but curiosity. to see the vestry, the loft, the very funnel through which human mischief had masqueraded as spectral voice. Reverend Trotter tried to sermonize on forgiveness, but his words drowned under whispered retellings of Purbright's calm explanation. Mrs. Pilkington became, briefly, a celebrity. She told and retold her part in the matter, with adjustments tailored to each audience. To one group she was the first to hear Margaret's protest. To another, she had bravely confronted Hargreaves herself. By the third telling, she implied she had suspected him all along. The truth mattered less than the theatrical pauses she employed. Fenwick, the organist, walked with restored pride. Freed from suspicion, he returned to bullying the choir with renewed vigour, reminding anyone who would listen that mimicry was beneath him. His indignation became a shield polished daily. Chubb the undertaker, though still gloomy, benefited from sympathy. Several households decided to prearrange funerals with him, to ensure dignity unspoiled by trickery. Chubb accepted contracts with funereal humility, secretly pleased that scandal had produced custom. Edgar Smeaton resumed his nightly occupation at the Hare and Hound, repeating loudly that he had always been innocent, as if reminding himself. His debts remained, but now he wore the air of a man who had survived trial by public opinion and found acquittal, even if no one else cared. As for Wilton, his dignity emerged bruised but intact. He spoke little, save to assure clients at the insurance office that grief had sharpened his sense of responsibility. The town, half admiring his composure and half relieved not to be lectured further, granted him space. Margaret's memory, though tinged with whispers, settled at last into respectability, and Hargreaves, poor, perspiring Hargreaves, was removed from his office of churchwarden. His embezzlement proved small, almost pitiable in scale. Yet in Flaxborough disgrace need not be large to last a lifetime. He moved quietly through side streets, hat pulled low, while neighbours nodded politely but avoided eye contact. The church roof would, in time, be repainted by someone else's accounts. Inspector Pubright, meanwhile, returned to the rhythm of paperwork. The pile of minor offences, bicycles without lamps, dogs unlicensed, the occasional indecent postcard, seemed almost comforting after the drama. He dealt with each slip of paper in his steady hand, his face betraying nothing more than mild amusement at the contrast between scandal and routine. Constable Love, less philosophical, continued to marvel.
So do you think folk will remember the truth?
That it was Hargreaves and his tube? Some will, Pubright said. Others will prefer the ghost. It makes for better storytelling at the hairdresser's. But isn't that unfair to Margaret? Pubright set down his pen. The truth is not always what people treasure. They prefer what gives them a sense of belonging. For a time, believing in Margaret's protest made them feel part of something larger. Now believing in Hargreaves's guilt gives them relief. Either way, she is remembered. That may be the most any of us can ask, Love frowned. And you, sir? What do you believe? Pubright smiled faintly. That human beings are most revealing when they gossip. They accuse others of what they themselves fear, and they listen hardest to the voices they most wish to hear. On Sunday evening, Pubright walked once more through the churchyard. The autumn air smelled of wood smoke and damp leaves. Margaret's grave lay quiet, the flowers freshly tidied by unseen hands. He paused before the stone, reading again the modest inscription. There was no echo, no whisper, only the distant hoot of an owl and the rustle of branches. He considered how easily a handful of words had unsettled an entire town. A simple phrase, rehearsed and projected, had shaken reputations, inflamed envy, and revealed petty ambitions. All the while, the dead lay silent. Removing his hat, Pubright inclined his head slightly, less in reverence than in acknowledgment of how the living had written their own story upon her name. Then he replaced his hat, straightened his coat, and walked back toward the square. The town had resumed its rhythm. Children skipped across the cobbles, shopkeepers locked doors, church bells chimed the hour. Life continued, not unchanged, but carrying within it a faint reminder that respectability is a costume easily ruffled. At the police station, Pubright returned to his desk. He sorted the papers into neat piles, drew his pen across the margin of the final report, and closed the file with quiet satisfaction. For all the town's drama, the affair had been resolved without force, without spectacle, only courtesy, patience, and attention to the small slips of human behavior. That, Pubright thought, was Flaxborough's truest lesson. Crime wore a polite face, and truth revealed itself only when asked gently. He leaned back, folded his hands, and allowed himself a small sigh of contentment. Another case concluded, another ripple in the quiet waters of the town. Tomorrow would bring fresh trivialities, perhaps another whisper of scandal, perhaps only bicycles again. Pubright did not mind. The world was full of voices clamoring to be heard. His task was simply to listen, and then, when the moment was right, to speak softly in return.